I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza.
It was the fall of 1918. World War I was nearing its end, and America was experiencing the patriotic height of imminent victory. For entertainment, people went to see silent movies and vaudeville shows. They attended public dance halls, skating rinks, and pool halls. In sports, the Chicago Cubs made it to the World Series. While men went to war, many women went to work for the first time. The population of Chicago was just over 2.5 million. Into this patriotic and prosperous society came a new enemy, far more deadly than the Central Powers of Europe, that caught both citizens and their leaders by surprise. This enemy was the terrible pandemic that became known as the Spanish influenza. It was the deadliest pandemic since the bubonic plague in the 14th century, and it came on suddenly and spread quickly. Estimates of influenza-related deaths vary widely, from 20 million to more than 100 million, but the current best guess is around 50 million, more than the number killed in World War I. People all around the world were affected by the virus, and there were no effective cures or vaccines to stop the spread. The deadliest phase of this so-called Spanish flu came in the fall of 1918 was extremely dangerous, taking the public as well as the government leaders by surprise. Initially, Chicago officials thought their city would not be greatly affected by this outbreak, and on September 23, 1918, City Health Commissioner John Dill Robertson proclaimed, "We have the Spanish influenza situation well in hand now," but Chicago's central geographic location and its position as a railroad hub for both troop movement and civilian transport made the city a prime target for the spread of the airborne virus. As the epidemic spread, it hit Chicago and the surrounding area hard. Local government and public health officials, at first slow to react, soon began limiting the rights of the public in order to manage the outbreak. But because these restrictions were implemented hastily, without a comprehensive plan, they were inconsistently applied and ineffective. The influenza outbreak began as an ordinary flu, and then it changed. It had become something monstrous, bearing little resemblance to what is ordinarily thought of as the flu. Patients with more serious symptoms were hospitalized. Many of these patients developed cyanosis, which caused their faces to turn blue from a lack of oxygen in the bloodstream, and many developed pneumonia, both signs that the patient was likely to die. Unlike previous influenza outbreaks, in which most of the deaths occurred in the very young and the very old, the 1918 virus killed mostly otherwise healthy adults in the prime of life. There was also a shortage of doctors and nurses, and those treating the victims of this outbreak were exposed to the disease daily, causing many of them to become sick and die as well. Hospitals were turning away the sick, there were no known cures, and the disease was spreading uncontrollably. As the epidemic continued to spread, many of those who exhibited symptoms died within hours. Others steadily got sicker over the course of a few days, and then their lungs filled with fluid, and they suffocated to death. Influenza victims began to fall dead in their homes and on the streets, until there wasn't even enough room for all the bodies. People began to panic. Initially, officials in Chicago advised the public on prevention activities, including disinfection, gauze masks, and getting plenty of rest. They recommended that people stay indoors and keep their homes well ventilated to circulate the contaminated air. They told people to stay away from large gatherings and to stay far away from any contaminated bodies. As the epidemic worsened, Chicago officials moved beyond recommending and advising. They implemented strict measures and intended to slow the spread of the disease. They closed down all theaters, dance halls, livestock sales, and many other public gathering places in the city. There was much disagreement about these measures, and in some locations, people rioted to get their rights back. Many had lost jobs due to the closing of theaters and other public locations, but health officials defended their actions because worry killed more people than the epidemic. At the same time, though, schools, churches, and offices remained open and the flu continued to spread. And it is here that Chicago's leaders most significantly failed in their responsibility to the public. Although many other cities closed their schools, Chicago schools stayed open because after much debate, officials believed children could be kept safer in school, where there were nurses to monitor their health and that of their families. Churches weren't closed because it was believed that they were important to morale. although pastors were encouraged to shorten their services. Businesses remained open, but were encouraged to stagger their hours to reduce commuting crowds. By allowing these public gathering places to remain open, officials virtually eliminated the benefits they hoped to gain by shutting down their theaters, dance halls, and sporting events, and other locations where groups of people gathered. The influenza epidemic peaked in Chicago in mid-October, when more than 2,000 deaths were reported every day, despite Dr. Robertson's public comments to the contrary throughout most of the serious period of the outbreak. The influenza epidemic had devastating effects on the city of Chicago. On September 21st, the health commissioner's statement about the potential spread of the virus from army camps to the city included this reassuring suggestion: "I see no cause for public alarm, but everyone developing any symptoms should be careful." On October 3rd, Dr. Robertson said, "You can keep well if you do your part," and added in bold letters the advice, "Don't worry." Then on October 7th, just a week before the death rate hit its highest point, Dr. Robertson was quoted saying, "The backbone of the epidemic is broken." Of course, it was not. In a report prepared by Dr. Robertson in the immediate aftermath of the epidemic, he defended his goal of preventing undue alarm, as newspaper headlines warned of very high numbers of people becoming ill and dying. In early October, the U.S. Surgeon General recommended that all public gathering places in Illinois be closed, but because the outbreak affected different parts of the state at different times, the restrictions had to be implemented locally. Additionally, it was too difficult to control the flow of information to the public. Newspapers sometimes reported information that led to increased panic, and public officials tried to counter this with a more reassuring message, leaving people uncertain about what to believe. Robertson and other public health officials offered numerous vaccines developed to prevent those who received them from contracting influenza, although there is no evidence that any of these vaccines were effective. Some political leaders knew this but promoted the vaccines anyway. They would appear to be doing something to protect the citizens, and at the same time, the public would feel better if they believed they could be protected against the disease. In any case, these politicians believed that it wouldn't hurt to get it, but the vaccine's main value was to reduce the panic that was spreading along with the epidemic. Many such examples of the panic have been documented, including from the city of Chicago the story of Peter Marazzo, who killed his wife and 4 children by slitting their throats. Brought to trial, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity due to his high fever brought on by influenza. The pandemic struck broadly and deeply. 28% of the U.S. population became ill, and 2.5% of the people who got sick ended up dying. If such a plague came today, killing the same percentage of Americans, more than 2.1 million people would die. Even though recommendations designed to slow the spread of the disease were made by the U.S. Surgeon General and by the Illinois Health Commissioner, timing and enforcement of restrictions fell to local officials, leading to mixed results and leaving them unable to tell if any of these measures had an effect on the spread of the virus. Clearly, this was a complicated problem. Previously during the war, rights had been taken away from the citizens because of disagreement about sending troops off to fight. During World War I, the Espionage Act, passed in June 1917, punished those who were convicted of interfering with military recruitment. They were sentenced to 20 years in prison and were fined $10,000. The responsibility of Chicago's leaders to protect the health of the public had to be balanced with the foundational requirement for personal rights and freedoms in the 1918 pandemic, tipping the balance in favor of public good. With not a very scrupulous eye towards civil liberties, they took all kinds of dramatic actions, but looking at all the patterns, the only thing that made any difference at all was keeping people away from each other until it could be burned out. The only partial implementation of this strategy in Chicago may have led to many deaths that could have been prevented. City leaders could have taken quick, decisive action to close down all gathering places, including schools, churches, and businesses, to slow the spread of the epidemic. Today, nearly 100 years later, this would still be extremely difficult to implement and would be tremendously disruptive both socially and economically. Even with today's sophisticated technology, science, and communications, deploying an effective response to a 1918-like epidemic would certainly face many of the same challenges as officials experienced in 1918.